So recently, it has come to my attention that Kim Kardashian, the menace of our society, has finally started her official true crime podcast. Now, we talked about before in previous videos the level of damage that these one-sided podcasts can do to actual victims, as they're often intended to expose some kind of framing or cover-up to get an incredibly guilty person out of prison. And I'm happy to say that Kim Kardashian's podcast is actually focusing on somebody who's completely innocent, where there's no physical evidence against them, and honestly, there's no evidence at all against them, and we should all get behind the freeing of Kevin Keith. No, I'm just kidding about that. Kevin Keith is incredibly guilty. In fact, I will lay out to you guys out there in the audience why Kevin Keith might actually be the most guilty person I've ever seen these innocence fraud people try to get out, and he's committed one of the most horrific crimes you can possibly imagine. But before we talk about Kevin Keith's gold medal in being a horrible person, we have a sponsor of today's video. Yes, that was a Noble Gold transition, so we're gonna toss it over to them. Have you ever wondered if investing in silver is a good idea? Well, good news for you. Colin Plume from our friends over at Noble Gold definitely thinks so. On National Desk recently, Plume laid out the fact that even though there's been some panic sell-offs of silver due to the low prices, it is one of the most useful metals in terms of industry in the world. It's used in electronics, electric cars, solar panels, and all manner of other things that are currently being subsidized by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a global warming bill, so you probably want to get in on this. As pre-pandemic levels of production resume, silver is expected to rocket, so what you need to do is call Noble Gold at 877-646-5347 and talk to a specialist about getting in so you don't miss out. You can also visit them at noblegoldinvestments.com, and guess what? This month, the month of October, if you start a qualifying gold and silver IRA with Noble Gold Investments, you will be gifted a 3-ounce American Virtue silver coin. It comes in this nice case, it's got some weight to it, it has Thomas Jefferson's picture on it. What more can you ask for? noblegoldinvestments.com, 877-646-5347. Thank you to Noble Gold for being a ride or die for this channel and sponsoring content like this, which honestly, I don't know the monetization status of what this video will be. So, the story that we're going to talk about today involves a man called Kevin Keith. And the reason we're going to talk about him is because he is prominently featured on Kim Kardashian's new podcast, which is an exclusive on Spotify called The System. And of course, this podcast is framed in such a way that is extraordinarily beneficial for Kevin Keith, who actually already had his sentence commuted from a death sentence to life without the possibility of parole. However, that's not enough for Kim Kardashian. She wants to see Kevin Keith walking the streets. But you might want to ask yourself, what exactly did Kevin Keith do? And by the way, I'm not going to say what he was accused of doing. I'm going to say what he actually did so you can understand it. Well, on February 13th of 1994, Kevin Keith decided to go visit his ex-girlfriend's house. Now, he wasn't looking for his ex-girlfriend. He was actually looking for his ex-girlfriend's brother, and we'll touch on that more a little bit later. So, he enters the place, and people understand and know that this is Kevin Keith, so they let him in without any level of forced entry, even though he's carrying a black bag with him, which he tells them apparently was his laundry. Now, Kevin Keith decides to ask for the person that he's looking for, and he is informed that that person is not present. And by the way, Kevin Keith's name is said first and last during the course of this encounter, but we will talk about it a little bit later, again, when we get into the evidence. Now, after waiting a little while, having a couple of glasses of water, Kevin Keith decided to open up his laundry bag and pull out a firearm. And when he pulled out the firearm, he ordered all of the people in the apartment that he entered to the ground, and then he proceeded to shoot each and every one of them while they were on the ground. And when I say each and every one of them, that may be a little bit misleading for you guys out there, because there was a total of 6 people shot by Kevin Keith on this fateful day, 3 of which were children. One of those children actually ended up dying due to the injuries that Kevin Keith inflicted on them. And by the way, these were young children. Again, we'll get into that a little bit later. Now, during the course of this event, one of the people, a man called Warren, who was the current boyfriend, got up after suffering multiple gunshot wounds, left the scene of the crime, and was shot at by Kevin Keith as he fled. He ultimately ended up surviving, even though he was shot in the jaw, shot in the back, and shot in multiple different places. Kevin Keith then got in the car that he drove there and fled the scene of the crime. This is what is proven out by the facts of the case. However, the way that Kim Kardashian tells it, there is no evidence at all whatsoever that proves that this horrific crime was in fact Kevin Keith.
They had no physical evidence whatsoever, and he was given the death penalty.
Now, the people who were killed in this incident were as follows: 24-year-old ex-girlfriend of Kevin Keith, Marshall Chapman. There was also 39-year-old Linda Chapman, who was the aunt, and of course 4-year-old Marcy Chapman. And her wounds and her death is so horrific because unlike the other two who died at the scene, she actually made it to the hospital, fought for her life for hours, and then ultimately ended up passing away. And the other kids, by the way, were critically wounded. In fact, when Kevin Keith fled to shoot at the boyfriend that was running away because he had been wounded and he was trying to get to what ultimately ended up being a restaurant to call for help, he actually saw one of the girls, turned around, fired back upon her, and wounded her in the arm. The boy, by the way, was actually shot in the gut and in surgery had to have some of his intestines removed. He also had to learn to walk all over again because these bullets were so damaging to his body. Now, Quentin, by the way, the boy that this actually happened to, says that he actually died during the course of this, and they were able to revive him on the helicopter on the way to the hospital because they had to be emergency airlifted from this horrific scene that Kevin Keith had left. Quote, "I died. They brought me back to life in the helicopter." Quentin was 4 years old when this happened, by the way, in case you were wondering. And Juanita actually has another account. She was 6 years old at the time of this horrific crime, and it goes as follows. And again, I'm quoting from her. "I was laying on the floor, shot, throwing up SpaghettiOs." Now, both of these kids were severely wounded, and due to the youth of the children involved in this incident, it turns out that they did not ultimately end up testifying against Kevin Keith. Prosecutors didn't want them to have to relive the trauma on the stand at age 6 and age 4, especially because they were also critically injured and going through physical therapy, something that young children shouldn't have to go through. However, Warren did testify against Kevin Keith, and his testimony was absolutely devastating at trial, and this ultimately led to Keith being convicted and being sentenced to death, and I should say, deservedly so. If you're looking to kill one person, you get mad that they're not there, and you decide it's a good idea to kill everybody in the family, even the children, and then you flee. That is not great. But of course, Kim Kardashian sees that alliterated name and thinks that's the guy I want to advocate for, because in 1994, there wasn't as sophisticated forensic collection methods, so maybe I can draw some gray area, throw a little mud on this case, poke holes around the edges, and pretend like Kevin Keith is innocent. And by the way, that is exactly what she did throughout the course of the podcast, talking about how Kevin Keith was such a great guy. Kevin Keith is such an amazing person. But here's the thing. Kevin Keith was a violent criminal. He was a drug dealer. And while you might not think that that is relevant, it turns out that is the exact crucial piece of evidence to let you know his motivation in committing this heinous crime.
Hi, I'm Kim Kardashian. You might have seen that recently I've gotten really involved in wrongful conviction and rehabilitation work. And there's one case in particular that I can't stop thinking about.
30-year-old Kevin Keith was arrested at his home in Crestline. He is charged with 3 counts of murder for allegedly killing 3 members of the Chapman family.
On February 13th, 1994, a gunman entered apartment 1712B of the Bucyrus Estates complex. He killed 3 people and severely wounded 3 others. 3 of the victims were children.
Now let's zoom back to the night in question, because on the night in question, Richard Warren recounts the events as they unfolded. After he says that Kevin Keith ended up putting everybody on the ground and was pointing guns at them, he actually was screaming and scolding his ex-girlfriend for using his first name during during the course of the conversation, because now she basically created a scenario where he had to kill them all. And one of the things that was also crucial from this portion of the testimony is what he ended up saying to the sister of the man that she was looking for, because that goes into our motivation. Now, while Marshall, and by the way, the name is spelled different in the court documents and is spelled different in the actual article that I'm citing, so I apologize if I get the pronunciation wrong, had the gun placed to her head by Kevin Keith, she pled for her life in the name of her children. And Keith responded, quote, "Well, you should have thought about this before your brother started ratting on people." Marshall responded, "Well, my brother didn't rat on anybody, and even if he did, we didn't have anything to do with it." Now, it turns out that Rudolph Chapman, the brother who was not present for this horrific crime, the person that Kevin Keith was looking for, actually did churn state's evidence a month prior, and this resulted in the arrest of Kevin Keith. So obviously, right there, you have a clear established motive against him because he was a serious drug dealer. And remember, this is the 90s, where you would get very serious sentences if you were convicted of those drug charges. So the fact that the current boyfriend, who doesn't know a lot about Kevin Keith or their relationship or what's going on with the brother, would overhear that, something that he wouldn't have just pulled out of nowhere, and then it would happen to be confirmed by later testimony because the officers know that this guy churned state's evidence, is absolutely crucial to what we're talking about in terms of Kevin Keith's guilt. This is often downplayed, ignored, dismissed, or people just pretend like it doesn't exist. This is the game that Kim Kardashian and all of Kevin Keith's supporters like to play. They say, oh, well, this didn't have anything to do with anything. The fact that Richard Warren was able to hear this, testify to this, is totally irrelevant. Who cares? Kevin Keith is totally innocent. Isn't he such a great guy? He would definitely not murder these people. Now, another thing that they like to harp on when they claim that there's no physical evidence at all whatsoever left at the scene of the crime or anything that ties Kevin Keith to this situation or anything like that, is the fact that they never found the murder weapon. The 9mm handgun used by Kevin Keith to shoot all of these people was not found at the scene or anywhere else. All they had to go on were shell casings, and the shell casings were everywhere due to the fact that Keith fired an insane number of shots. Now, although the police never found the gun, they never found the murder weapon, they never found that key piece of evidence, they did recover 24 shell casings at the scene of the crime. Now, this goes to the fact that Kevin Keith was absolutely merciless in his attempt to kill this group of people, half of which were children, one of which he was successful in killing, but it also gave police something to go on, because if you have the shell casings, you could tell what type of gun it was fired from, and you could match it to other spent shell casings that might be found at other locations. And one of the other locations that they found a shell casing at that actually matched the bullet shell casings from the scene of the crime was outside the local General Electric plant. Now, the reason why this is crucial is because it turns out Kevin Keith's girlfriend worked at this plant, and where they found these shell casings was where Kevin Keith pulled up in a vehicle to pick up his girlfriend. So shell casings tied Kevin Keith to both locations, and we know he was at the General Electric plant because he picked up his girlfriend, and more importantly, we have another connection, which of course is the vehicle that was being driven. You see, Kevin Keith, not the brightest bulb out there. Kevin Keith, not the smartest man, because when he was trying to drive out of the area, Kevin Keith actually got himself stuck in a snowbank. Now, when Kevin, or whoever was the real shooter, wink wink, got themselves stuck in a snowbank, a neighbor actually noticed the fact that they were working really hard for about 5 minutes to get themselves out. They got out of the car. They were able to spot them. They were able to give what they later described as a 90% certainty that that was Kevin Keith at trial, even though initially they couldn't make out too much about their face. But more crucially, we got a description of the car, which was described as a cream-colored car, which I will point out and talk about a little bit later because that is one of the points of contention. And there were tire treads, but more importantly, there was an imprint of about half of a license plate where you could see the plate number in the snow. So when the police and the forensics people showed up to the scene of the crime, they got a cast of the license plate that was there. And luckily for those of you out there who think Kevin Keith is totally innocent, it turns out that neither the tire treads nor the imprint, the cast of the license license plate match Kevin Keith's car. Also, Kevin Keith drove a blue car. So obviously, this piece of evidence is absolutely crucial to the defense of Kevin Keith, and clearly and obviously shows that he did not in fact do it. However, I do remember weirdly saying something about Kevin Keith going to pick up his girlfriend and a shell casing being found at the site where he went to pick up his girlfriend, because it turns out, and I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, Kevin Keith's girlfriend actually has a father, and Kevin Keith's girlfriend's father actually has a car. And when the police looked at the last 3 digits on the license plate of his girlfriend's father's car, it turns out that the car license plate matched perfectly with the imprint that they had. On top of that, the car color was a green, like a light green, one of those Oldsmobile 80s greens, which can often, in the right lighting, be mistaken for a cream or a yellow color. And remember, it was snowing, it was dark. You can understand why this might be conflated, and I can show you examples in other cases of people mistaking white cars for red cars based on the lighting conditions present at the time. So, we have an Oldsmobile that matches the description of the Oldsmobile. The color's a little off, but the last 3 digits of the license plate fit in perfectly with the imprint cast that was taken in the snowbank that Kevin Keith drove into. We know that Kevin Keith picked up the daughter of the registered owner of the Oldsmobile, so all we have to do is match the tire tread, and then we will determine whether or not Kevin Keith was driving this vehicle, and therefore Kevin Keith is guilty. And when the forensic experts decided to compare and contrast the tire indentation to this 84 Oldsmobile that matched in all these other ways, it turned out that the cast and the tires on the vehicle did not in fact match. They were not accurate. They were not the same tire. This was proof positive that this wasn't the car. Now that might sound very compelling. That might sound very interesting, and you might be wondering why I, Sean Fitzgerald, the actual Justice Warrior, am telling you that Kevin Keith is 100% guilty when I just told you that the tire treads did not match the tracks that were left at the scene of the crime. Well, the thing is they actually got possession, the police, of the vehicle weeks after the crime actually occurred. And the reason why they got possession is because Kevin Keith's girlfriend tried to sneak a joint into the prison when he was arrested for the crime, so they didn't actually have the car immediately after, and they didn't actually associate Kevin Keith with the car in any meaningful way until she drove that vehicle to the prison in order to visit him pre-trial. Now, when you have this 043 last digits of the license plate matching the vehicle, and you can see how in a certain light this vehicle can be viewed as the eyewitness as described in those conditions, you think to yourself, well, it's kind of odd that weeks later, these tire treads don't seem to match what we're talking about. It's a little bit weird, and honestly, these tires look fresh to death. They look brand new. They look like they've been replaced recently. So after the tires were shown to not match, rather than let this go, the detectives decided it would be a good idea to speak with the registered owner of the vehicle and ask him about his maintenance and when he last replaced his tires. And he had told them that 6 months prior to the murder, he had replaced the tires and that he had driven about 3,000 miles on these tires. And he gave them the brand that he purchased in order to replace those tires. Now, I don't know if you guys know anything about vehicles. I don't know if you guys know anything about tires or anything like that, but typically, you don't replace all 4 tires on your car 6 months after you've already replaced all 4 tires on your car, especially when the wear and tear is that of wear and tear from about 3,000 miles driven during that 6-month timeline. So, when the police saw brand new tires and they asked for the receipt from Alton, who is the registered owner of the vehicle, and the brand of the tires on the vehicle didn't match the brand on the receipt, this brought up a little bit of suspicion. Then, when they figured out that the tires that were on the vehicle, which were supposedly put on 6 months prior, were not actually available to the public until January of 1994, which was 1 month prior, this also seemed very suspicious. So one of the things that the police did was order the same exact tires that were on the Oldsmobile prior to the replacement, and what they found is that those tires actually matched the tire tread that was left in the snowbank. Now, to be clear, this is absolutely devastating, and credit to law enforcement for not letting this go when the tire tread evidence didn't come up the way that they were expecting, but noticing that the tires didn't match those on the receipt. However, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you the ridiculous explanation being put forward by the defense as of 2010. Remember, this case was 1994, but in an affidavit from 2010, the girlfriend alleges that actually she replaced all the tires in secret in January on her grandfather's car, and I'm sorry if I called him the father earlier, it's actually the grandfather, without telling him. So when he testified in court that he didn't replace the tires, and to his knowledge there was no tires being replaced, that was actually true, but in reality, in actuality, she replaced the tires because she was hoeing around, and girls that were mad that she was sleeping with their man would often slash the tires. I'm not joking, that is what is being said more or less. Now, of course, this comes into play when you factor in that these tires weren't available until 3 weeks into January because they were a new make and model of tire, and of course, Melanie has no receipts or anything like that. She paid cash because she didn't want anybody to know about this, not even her grandfather, and she just somehow got her car to a place, bought 4 new tires, then replaced the tires. No big deal, nothing to see here, not suspicious. This is legitimately the explanation. And coincidentally, another car with the exact tires that were on the Oldsmobile, which matches the description of the vehicle, by the way, and has the same last 3 digits of the license plate, happened to be there at that time. Don't worry about it. Don't think about it too much. Kim Kardashian says he's innocent. So let's be clear about what all of this means in its totality, and I don't want to bury the lead. It first and foremost means that Kevin Keith is 100% guilty of this massacre. You have 3 witnesses that were shot by Kevin Keith that night that identified him as the shooter. One of them at trial because of the young age of the other ones, but the one at trial had the most crucial piece of information, which was Kevin Keith saying he was doing this because the brother of his ex-girlfriend ratted on him. It turned out that the brother of the ex-girlfriend did turn state's evidence against Kevin Keith. So you have a clear and obvious motive. You have information being communicated to Warren, who survived, and he wasn't intended to survive this incident. That would confirm that it was in fact Kevin Keith. And then you have the automobile evidence. The automobile license plate that was imprinted on the snow matches the license plate of the father of Kevin Keith's current girlfriend, thus tying him to the scene of the crime. The tire treads that were on the vehicle at the time of the crime match the tire treads in the snow, and the new tires were put on not in the time frame as outlined and didn't match the brand of the receipt that the father of the girlfriend actually had. On top of that, you have a shell casing that matches all the other shell casings at the scene of the crime, found at a location we know Kevin Keith was at with the vehicle in question. That ties this whole thing together in a neat little bow. And what do they have on Kim Kardashian's side? What do they have on the Innocence Fraud side? A bunch of innuendo, a bunch of denialism, a bunch of things that you're supposed to totally ignore, but we're supposed to focus on the lighting conditions and how that could have affected the view of the car on the night in question. And we also got to focus on racism, because even though each and every victim, for the most part in this incident, were black, and everybody involved for the most part in this incident was black, it turns out that Richard Warren, the current boyfriend, the man who was shot multiple times, who had to write down Kevin Keith's name in the hospital because he was shot in the jaw, he couldn't speak, turns out he's a white guy. So him testifying makes this case a case of evil white racism, and no, I'm not joking, that is heavily implied throughout the course of the podcast. Because he happened to be dating a black girl, and he happened to be shot multiple times by his black girlfriend's ex-boyfriend, it turns out that it must be systematic structural racism against Kevin Keith. Isn't he the victim of racism? All he tried to do was murder 6 people. 5 of them happened to be black. 3 of them were children. 1 of those children he successfully murdered. Look, there is no argument at all whatsoever for Kevin Keith's innocence. People will talk about how there's no DNA. There's no DNA. The case occurred in 1994. There were also victims that were wounded that needed to be airlifted to the hospital in an effort to save their lives. They weren't stopping to preserve the crime scene for DNA. They were worried about the children that Kevin Keith viciously shot and trying to save their lives, one of which they failed to do so tragically. Also, again, 1994, this wasn't a time where DNA was broadly known about and worth preserving, and we didn't even have things like touch DNA that were looked for at the scene of the crime. People looked for fingerprints and all that stuff. But the overall evidence, the totality of the circumstances, and the key pieces of information that make it 100% clear that the only person who could have done this was Kevin Keith should be enough, and this man should never be let out onto the streets, no matter how many times Kim Kardashian wants to tell you that he's such a sweet guy. Kevin Keith has such a good heart. All he did was mercilessly execute people he ordered onto the ground, even though they weren't even the actual people that he was angry at. Because he was so angry, he just wanted to inflict harm on everybody. He wanted to teach somebody a lesson for snitching on him, so he decided to kill cousins, children, sister, everybody involved that he just happened to come across, because that's the kind of man that Kevin Keith is. Now look, I will link all the evidence in full in the description box of this video, because as always, you don't have to take my word for it, but I'm also going to link the article that I referenced throughout the course of this video, where the two kids speak on what happened to them that night and talk about how the whole Innocence Fraud campaign is trying to ignore them, trying to dismiss them, and a lot of people don't even realize that 3 people survived this incident, and all 3 of them say it's Kevin Keith, because they're just trying to cover it up, because as we've seen time and time again with these Innocence Fraud campaigns, what they do is ignore inconvenient victims, because they get in the way of what they're trying to push forward. And in this case, it is getting out a triple murderer, a mass murderer, even though the evidence is overwhelming against him. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you liked the video, you can show them by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content. You can follow me on all my social medias. You can support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me talking about the overwhelming evidence against Kevin Keith. Till next time.